Gentlemen, friends, it's a great pleasure to welcome such a large audience for what's going to be a really terrific speech or talk by a very distinguished pilot. I've known Cliff for a very long time, just under 60 years, which does sound a very long time. We both joined the RAF together as Halton apprentices, and we were both commissioned straight from Halton. All that's a very long time ago. Cliff went on to a very distinguished career, retiring as a 3-star air marshal. And I always thought Cliff, who's one of the nicest people in aviation, is quite unique amongst air marshals in that he carried on flying. He's flown all of his RAF career and subsequently. And not many air marshals do that. I can think of only 3 or 4 that carry on flying in civilian life after the military. Cliff's going to tell a great story tonight. I'm tempted to tell you 3 little snippets about him. He's believed to be the only man to have flown all marks of the Spitfire, which is really rather unique. He was once chief flying instructor of a gliding club at Bouchon, which is a real distinction. Well, I think so, because I'm a great gliding enthusiast. And the other one, he really is a fighter pilot. But when he was AOC 11 Group, which amalgamated with 18 Group, he suddenly had under his command Nimrod aircraft. And so he was able to fly big 4-engine Nimrods. Well, I think that's enough for me. They always used to say you can tell a fighter pilot, but you can't tell him much. That's probably true, but Cliff is going to tell us a lot. So Cliff, it's over to you. You have control.
Thank you, Terry. And I'll remind it in front of an audience that you owe me a beer for this.
Oh, more than a beer, I can tell you.
Okay, well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'll start with this slide to set the scene, if I may. And well, that woohoo from my son rather sets the scene for what has been, as Terry has said, several decades of woohoo, as far as I'm concerned, about flying. That was my son. That was my final, shall we say, frontline display a couple of years ago, when I was privileged to lead 15 Spitfires at Duxford. And that was a lovely way to go out. I call this flying vintage aircraft a ramble through some types I've been privileged to fly. I have been very privileged to fly some of these old airplanes, and some of them not so old. I call it a ramble because every time I give a presentation similar to this, it's different as I go through it, because I think of different things to say about different airplanes. So it's entirely unscripted. I get to the end of it thinking, oh, I should have said that about that airplane. On the other hand, there are people who have listened to me before and said, oh, well, that was completely different from your last presentation. It's just because I think of things as I go through. I do apologize that I won't be able to cover all of the airplanes. Terry's just alluded to things like the Nimrod, which was a great airplane, and one I was, again, super lucky to fly. But I'm going to try and contain it as much as I can to the old aeroplanes, which I think probably is where we come to vintage aircraft. And that's not to say that the airplanes I'm about to show you are not vintage in their own right now, because that's where I started. First, a little bit about me, for those who don't know. I did start at on the Jet Provost after, as Terry has said, Halton apprenticeships. And I went on to the Mark III and Mark IV first, actually, to do my flying course at Cranwell. 170 hours of probably the best training, I think, in the world, and it set me fair for the years to come. The airplane itself, the Jet Provost, which again, Terry has just said, I re-qualified again on last year. That is the 3 and the 5, some 55 years after I first qualified on the airplane. It was an airplane which was quite benign for those who've flown it. But the applied flying was really quite top notch, and the instructors who taught you the basics, more than the basics of formation flying, it was a foundation which I could not have wished for better. I had a few incidents in this. I nearly lost, nearly got chopped off the course for doing illegal formation with a couple of other students. I went up, 3 of us going for, I shouldn't tell stories of indiscipline, should I? But I will. I was going up to do a solos general handling sortie, and there were 2 other students who were going up to do similar. And we had a hasty talk as we were walking to the airplanes, decided to meet over Horncastle, which we duly did, and took it in turns to do a little bit of formation, until at one point one of our number broke away and didn't come back. So we decided to go home. When I got back to Cranwell, I was met by that young man who was looking very glum, and he'd as he broke away, he came back and rejoined, but didn't rejoin on us. He rejoined on 2 instructors from Manby, and they quickly recognized this student who had just suddenly joined on them, and they were trappers, examiners. So all came to the fore. So Wing Commander J.M.A. Parker gave me one short lesson and said, "You're lucky to stay on the course." But I did. I was on a course of 40, and competition to get to Valley on the advanced flying course was quite intense. When you think the training today in the Air Force numbers going through, there was 40 on our course when there were about 3 other flying training schools. Anyway, 10 of us went on to the NAT, which is where I went to Valley to do another 70 hours. What a wonderful little aeroplane. I had a mad Irishman, or I call him, he's still around and some of you might know him, John McWilliam. He lives down near Kemble. He's a very accomplished glider pilot now. John scared me twice. One was a slow roll over Wales, and I can still see that stone wall going past my cockpit. And the other time was when he was sailing. He was a great sailor off the North Stack of Anglesey in a gale. And I was convinced I was going to die. And he was out the back like a maniacal Captain Ahab. But anyway, flying the aeroplane was quite stunning little aeroplane. But I think you will have heard more of that from other people. I then went on to the Hunter, an aeroplane I'd always wanted to fly. From Valley, we were streamed. I'd wanted to fly the Hunter operationally. It was coming to the autumn of its life in the Air Force, I suppose. And I was dying to get out to the Gulf and places like that and fly this airplane while it was still operational. But it wasn't to be, but I was selected for the Lightning, which I'll come on to in a second. I wasn't disappointed with that at all, but it would have been nice to fly this airplane. Quite an airplane I displayed latterly, quite the nicest airplane to fly, very light, with adequate and more power, 10,000 pounds of thrust from the Avon engine. It really is fingertip flying in the airplane, and eminently flyable in all regimes. So I was very lucky, and we did our gunnery and combat down at Chivenor, which was a real high point at that point. Okay, I went on to the Lightning. I think this is an absolutely stunning picture of the Lightning, absolutely in its element. I arrived at Coltishall. There was a bit of a false start at Coltishall, and I might say at this point that after I'd finished at Cranwell, I had a month or so to kill, and I managed to get to Northumbrian University Air Squadron and fly the Chipmunk, which I hadn't flown on my flying training, and all the other senior cadets at Cranwell were telling us we weren't real pilots unless we'd flown a piston engine airplane. So I'd been to Northumbrian University Air Squadron and flown the Chipmunk and qualified on that. Probably the best thing I ever did, because in the gaps between basic training, advanced training, Hunters, and latterly the Lightning, I had several months to kill. And because I was qualified on the Chipmunk, I was able to go to flying units. So probably the best thing I ever did. And it will come to, as it came to pass later on in my career. I flew with a chap called Jimmy Jewell on my first ride in the Lightning. And the first ride in the Lightning at Coldershall was really an instructor's benefit. And you went in in this case, the T5, the two-seater, and he decided to do a reheat takeoff, which you didn't really need to do in the T5 or the Mark III. It had more than enough power without reheat, but he did one anyway. And as we were going up at this sort of angle, leaving Norfolk behind as if somebody had grabbed the world and pulled it away from you, quite stunning performance. He looked across at me with a laconic voice and said, "There you are, young man." He said, "The only reason we've got wings on this airplane is to keep the nav lights apart." So I much enjoyed my course on that. I was posted to Treble 1 Squadron, and at Watersham, again, is East Anglia, a station I was to be posted to for about 6 years of my Air Force career at one stage or another. I show this picture because the Lightning, with all of its performance, I always think this is wonderful. It's just on supersonic, and you can see all the shock waves being formed. In latter days, in days before me, I should have said, on Treble 1, there was a chap called Bugs Bendel, who was on the Mark I. And if you ever get the chance to read his book, Never in Anger, I don't think Bugs is with us any longer, but he used to be the display pilot in the Mark I, and they had a visit to Watersham from the Royal College of Defence Studies. And it was a cold October day, and they were all standing around the balcony at the tower. And as you know, with windows in the tower, they all lean outwards. Anyway, Bugs got it wrong and went supersonic as he went past the tower and blew all the windows out. He actually demolished a lot of the prefabricated tower as well. You need to read his book for the hilarious interview he had with the wing commander. But the line book at Watersham on Treble 1 had a line from an army officer who was in that group standing around the balcony. And he was heard to say, brushing glass off his greatcoat shoulders, he said, "I give these Air Force chappies their due, they spare no expense," which was, but that was the Lightning. I did 7 very happy years on the Lightning, crewing about 1,300 hours. It was a great captain making aeroplane as well, because you were always short of fuel and you really did know where you could go for a port in a storm. And it's not infrequently we finished up in other airfields when we ran a bit short of fuel. I went on to the Phantom. This is an F4J when I'm about to attempt to engage with the basket. I went on to actually the FGR2 first. I did about 10 years on the Phantom on and off, right up to and including station commander at Falklands. This is the F4J. I was lucky enough to command 74 Squadron, again at Watersham. Probably the best time for time warplane I ever flew. Not the best handling. Can you imagine an airplane which has one aileron going down when you want to roll it and the other one with spoiler on the other wing? So if you're doing combat in the Phantom at high incident, you couldn't roll the airplane towards your enemy, such that it was, because if you try to roll lefts, for example, if you use the aileron, the airplane would roll right. It would roll the opposite way because of the spoiler. So you had to fly it on rudder, keep the stick central and fly it on rudder at high incidence. So anybody who says jet pilots don't know how to use rudders, well, this disproves the rule. I found that in my slide mine the other day. I thought I'd throw it in. It just reminded me that that's 43 years ago that picture was taken up over the North Norwegian Sea, earlier than when I was on 74. This was taken when I was flying out of Lucas. And then it was in and on to the Tornado eventually. I went to the Falklands, as I said, as station commander. I flew the Phantom down there, and that was the last time I flew the Phantom when I left the Falklands. I also was lucky enough to fly the Sea King and the Hercules while I was down there, albeit on both those other airplanes, as they say, I always had to fly with a responsible adult in the other seat, which was just as well. Tornado, I came back to Coningsby and retrained and up to operational status on the Tornado. A good aeroplane, albeit it wasn't overpowered and certainly wasn't an F-16 type of aeroplane. I then went for a short holiday down into Gulf War I, commanding the Dhahran wing of Tornado F3s, GR1s and GR1Bs, but then came back to Coningsby in the April. And of course, this is where really the story really starts for me, because Coningsby, I was really lucky to command a station. You're lucky to command a station in the Royal Air Force at all. And the fact that I was sent to Coningsby as station commander was a double plus, because it had the Battle of Britain Memorial flight on it. And of course, it had the Hurricanes and Spitfires. I didn't fly the Lancaster. I flew in the Lancaster, but the Lancaster was, we were a bit short on hours and the pilots needed all that they could get. So it would have been a bit presumptuous of me to, much as I would have loved to have gone it, I stuck with the Hurricane, and who could, in this case, the Hurricane was your first steed. I'd got about, by this time, about 400 hours on Chipmunks. So over the years on various tours or gaps in tours. So at least I had some tailwheel experience. In the BBMF, they gave you about 15 hours on the Hurricane before you were allowed loose on any of the other airplanes. I think this is me at Norwich Airport in early days. The Hurricane is a venerable beast, and some of you I know in the audience have flown the airplane. Fast it is not. One only has to look at the depths of the chord of the wing to realize that you could have put a supercharged Griffon in the Hurricane and it wasn't going to go any faster. It was an airplane that we were very lucky to have, as you will know from your history books, produced by hawkers, and of course using techniques which were tried and tested at that time before the war, metal stringers with canvas covers. So the production methods were all in place, which when I get to the Spitfire, they weren't. So when we arrived at the Battle of Britain, of course, the Hurricane was in much greater numbers than Spitfires. There's very often, and correctly said, the Hurricane shut down more aircraft in the Battle of Britain than the Spitfire did, but of course there were a lot more of them. And when one examines the statistics, actually the kill ratio of the Spitfire was higher, only marginally, but it was higher. I marvel at the young men who flew this airplane. When I first taxied out in the Hurricane for my first sortie, I was convinced that there was something wrong. I'd been briefed fully by Paul Day, the OCBBMF, but I couldn't believe the noises and sounds that were coming back to me. This didn't sound like that lovely Rolls-Royce growl that you hear outside. I was convinced something had come off the engine, but all the people as I was taxiing past and the ground crew all seemed quite happy. So if they were happy, so was I. So I taxied out. The Hurricane is quite a warm aeroplane. Why? Because, and I'll come on to the Spitfire in a second, the fuel tank, one of the fuel tanks is just there where I'm putting my arrow. The others are two in the wing roots. And therefore your feet are right against the firewall for the engine. Hence the noise and also quite a lot of heat, certainly at low level, probably an advantage at high level. The canopy on on the Hurricane, and it's something I learned. It looks like I'm a bit confused here in the picture. I probably was. No GPS in those days. The Hurricane has got a natural suction to the cockpit. Witness the fact so many Hurricane pilots were burnt when they opened the cockpit if they got a small fire. It does have a natural suction, and I was flying on my first away day, shall we call it, down near Aylesbury from Coningsby, and I got as far. It was a lovely sunny day, and I got as far, I don't know, somewhere like Grantham or somewhere like that, and I decided to fly with the cockpit open. So I slid the cockpit open, and that was the last I saw of all my maps. So then it was what we call, as you call it, IFR, I follow roads. And so using some knowledge of the bigger towns, I actually found my way to the destination and back without a map, but therein lies a story. The airplane to fly, and again, other Hurricane pilots probably will attest, the airplane is quite neutrally stable at certain in pitch. It turns quite tightly, but in certain configurations, you can find the airplane when you're say in a wing over. The control column will get quite light, and you'll find yourself almost pushing on it. Rolls very well. It rolls very, very well. And of course, on the ground, it's got that lovely wide undercarriage, and the tail wheel, unlike the Spitfire, you have to break out. It's on a spring. It will eventually break out, but at least it gives you quite a lot of good control on the ground. And of course, look at the size of the fin and rudder, and indeed the size of the fuselage. So the airplane is eminently handleable on the ground. That's for sure. It does tend to, as you're coming in to land in the Hurricane, you do tend to be fairly close to the backstop. So if you are inclined to take the power off a bit too early, you can feel a bit of a clonk as the control column hits the stop, and you can think to yourself, oh. So you do need to get yourself into a 3-point attitude, still with a bit of power on, before you flare. But nonetheless, an excellent, excellent airplane in all respects. That's me still looking confused. Another nice airborne shot. It shows that the airplane, of course, largely came into a lot of ground attack, and of course was used in the desert, where it could fly off strips that probably a Spitfire couldn't fly off. That's for sure. This is a Canadian built one, I think. As you can see, this one has got 12.303 machine guns. And of course, this airplane went on to fly with up to and including 30mm slung underneath for tank busting. But of course, this is what I wanted to get onto. This is not the first Spitfire I flew. It was a Mark II. Why they trusted me with probably the most valuable airplane in the world for my first solo, heaven knows. But I flew the Mark II, which was a true Battle of Britain veteran. This is the Mark V, which was also on the flight, and another absolute delightful airplane to fly. And when I got in the Spitfire, much as I like the Hurricane and what a wonderful airplane it is, the change is marked. It is true what other pilots have said about the Spitfire. It's active in all axes. It's got a very, very powerful elevator. And so in pitch, it's very sensitive, and you've always got fine pitch control. That's for sure. It rolls quite well. I don't think it rolls quite as fast as the Hurricane, maybe by a degree or two. And it certainly doesn't roll as fast as the Messerschmitt, but it rolls well. And of course, it's got this amazing wing, which was a problem in the early days, trying to fit weapons into it. Designed by a Canadian called Beverly Shenstone. Lots of us talk about him stealing it off the Germans. He didn't, not with the shape he may have used, but he certainly didn't the rest of the characteristics of the wing. And that wing, in various guises, but the fundamental shape, yes, there were clips clipped bits off it, and they added bits onto it as well for certain marks. But the basic wing shape stayed for all marks of Spitfire. And when I got into the Spitfire, it was faster, it was light, and it was an absolute delight to fly. This one's got about a 1300, I think it's the Merlin 35, others will correct me, but it's about 1200, 1300 horsepower. The early Spitfires went from about 1,000 up to about 1350 for the Mark V, and we'll get on to the others later. Of course, we had two Mark 19s. This is not untypical of some of the hot starts in the Mark 19 we had before we got a better priming system. The Griffon engine, which is a derivative of the R engine, and they were the engines in the S6B. Some people think that the Merlin was derived from the seaplanes that won the Schneider Trophy. They actually weren't. They were a long-term development from things like the Kestrel, which people like Howard and others have flown behind in the Hawkers. But the R engine was a big V12, 37 litres. And as you can see, quite exciting to start sometimes. Probably the fastest Spitfire that's ever been built. It's got a lovely wraparound canopy, no guns in the wing, and these, with the extra fuel that they had in the leading edge and indeed behind it, this aeroplane would go to Berlin and back on its photographic reconnaissance sorties. And I once spoke to a wartime Spitfire pilot who flown these things, and he remembers being at the height he was coming back from Berlin, and they had to use every ounce of the fuel they had. So he was waiting for the engine. They used to wait for the engine to die just momentarily, and then they'd switch tanks. He couldn't afford to wait and change early because he just wasn't going to get it home. And these airplanes from the Luftwaffe were trying to get to him, but were just falling off. And he knew at one point he would have to change the tank. And he said, I managed to change the tank. As the engine started to die, I lost about 1,000 feet. And by that time, these Luftwaffe, I think they were 190s, were then re-attacking, but he managed to then regain his height. And they just couldn't get to him. He was just too fast and too high. Quite a marvelous aeroplane. I should say that back on the Phantom days, particularly when I was at Lucas, on my flight, I was a flight commander then, was a young man called Mark Hanna. And that was going to be interesting because I was flying a Mark 19 at Mildenhall, doing a synchronized display with another Battle of Britain flight pilot with two Mark 19s. And after I landed, I went over and there was Mark Hanna, Ray Hanna, his father, sitting on the grass. And we talked, and I was just coming to the end of my tour at Coningsby. And he said, would you like to come and join the OFMC when you've finished at Coningsby? And I said, well, I'm staying in the Air Force, but yes, I'd be delighted, which is what I did. And that opened the door into civilian flying. But just to go back to the 19, pressurized as it was as in the old days, no door on the other side, and with that wraparound windscreen, the drag rise on a Spitfire, one of the biggest drag points was actually on the bulletproof windscreen. The aeroplane itself, the wing, was marvelous and actually was better, had a better critical mark number than anything else. Like, for example, the Mustang didn't have as a higher critical mark number, but of course the Mustang had a lot of weight, so it went pretty fast anyway. Okay, I joined OFMC and I was delighted to do so. And in my spare time, this is not MH434, the famous Spitfire that still resides at Duxford, but another Mark 9, which I was flying. It's just such a nice picture And I don't have some very good pictures of MH434, surprisingly. I personally like this series of Spitfires. I'll come back to the earlier ones in a minute. The Mark II and the Mark V were dainty, I suppose is the best way of putting it. Absolutely delightful to fly. Big chipmunks, I like to describe them as. But the extra weight, the Mark IX and 16s had the biggest Merlin they ever put in a Spitfire in a 1600 horsepower 60 series. And I loved the balance of the Mark IX and 16s. Absolutely gorgeous to fly. With that extra weight, just gave an extra solidity. And I personally prefer to do aerobatics in this aeroplane than probably the early ones. But I know that people, Charlie Brown and I have discussed this at times, and he's a great exponent of the Spitfire, of course. And of course, he loves his Mark V. During the war, Jeffrey Quill, the test pilot, eventually thought the Mark 14 was his favorite. Johnny Johnson thought the Mark 9 was the best airplane. And the test pilots, Alex Henshaw, who obviously was a famous production pilot, loved the Mark V and did the most amazing display in it. Just a quick one, I mentioned clipped wings earlier on. The clip wings were done for rather low level flying in the Spitfire, and I've flown the clip wing Spitfire. I'm a bit of a purist. I like the full wing on the Spitfire, particularly when you're doing looping maneuvers, because in the clip wing Spitfire, at the slower speed as you're pulling, the ailerons tend to snatch a little. If you can imagine, the ailerons are right out here right out towards the wingtip anyway. And they tend to snatch a little, not uncomfortably, and it flies beautifully. But as I say, I'm a purist. So I flew in MH434. I was delighted to be able to fly it. I think I took the first Spitfire to the Czech Republic and also later on to Warsaw. More of that in a minute. I always remember landing at Pardubice in the Spitfire, and they had a lot of the veterans there. There wasn't a dry eye in the house. I'll show that picture because it's taken by John Dibbs. John Dibbs took a lot of these pictures, and John was quite a demanding photographer in what he wanted you to do and how close you wanted to get. Some of the things he asked you to do were sort of a bit marginal, and so we all backed off. But that was a case of flying within about 50 feet of the tail of the Bonanza. And all John wanted to do was for us to try and replicate a famous black and white picture from the Second World War. And he said, "You'll get to within 50 feet, a little bit off the tail, then just roll as hard and pull past the tail." And as you can see, I'm using pretty much full aileron as we go past. But no other than John Dibbs could get a picture like that. And I'll just put this one up as well, because it's the same Mark IX that we were talking about. Down here is the Mark 16, probably one of the nicest. They all fly beautifully, the Spitfires, they're so well balanced. But this Mark 16, which I was to fly later on, which embarrassingly has got my initials on, is probably one of the nicest Spitfires I've ever flown. The Mark 16s were only different from the Mark IX, not just because they had bubble canopies. A lot of Mark IXs had bubble canopies, but as they came down the production line, if they fitted a Packard Merlin to them, they became Mark 16s. If they fitted a Rolls Merlin to them, then they were Mark IXs, and it was simple as that. This is sort of in the order of things that I managed to fly these aeroplanes, again with OFMC. I was at home on a midday week. I think I was by this time Sasso 11 group. And I got a phone call from Mark, who was inclined to just phone you out of the blue. And he said, Cliff, will you go and pick the Sea Fury up from Yeovilton after the Saturday display this weekend? I said, well, I've not flown the Fury at all, Mark. He said, well, you'll learn then, won't you? Right. And said, I happened to have the pilot's notes for the Fury, which I'd been reading, hopefully, that I would get the chance to fly. So I said, yeah, I'd delighted as a first solo. I said, there's no one down there to supervise me, of course. That's the way things were on OFMC. Anyway, I read the books. He gave me a few tips over the phone. I said, how am I supposed to get down there? He said, oh, well, take the Yak 50 down to Yeovilton. Someone else will bring it back. I said, Mark, I haven't flown the Yak 50. And before he could reply, I said, I know, I'll learn. So I took the Yak 50 down to Yeovilton and to see this airplane, this very airplane. And it's an Iraqi Fury, one that was given to them. It's a naval airplane, but in a land-based configuration. And when I was down there, it's quite amusing. I was talking to some old Navy pilots that I knew, and one of whom had actually flown Sea Furies off carriers. And I was talking to them, and they said, oh, Cliff, you coming to the wardroom afterwards, thinking that I was staying for the Sunday? I said, no, I'm taking the Sea Fury back to Duxford. They looked at me and they said, but you've not flown the Sea Fury. I said, no, but I'm about to go and have a go. He said, well, for 15 minutes, these 4 naval pilots who all had flown the Sea Fury provided to give me a masterclass in what not to do in a Sea Fury. And one of them said to me, when you get on the runway, because you're a Spitfire man, you'll try and pick the tail up too quickly. I said, so don't be tempted to pick the tail up too quickly. Let it come up in its own time. So I got the thing started, and you're lord of all you survey in this wonderful big 2,500 horsepower engined aeroplane. And sure enough, I got out on the runway and I was saying, don't get the tail up too quickly. Don't get the tail up too quickly. So I left it down and left it down and left it down. Eventually I thought, as I was rolling down, I was moving quite quickly. I thought, I'll get the tail up now. Yeah, I got it up too early, and I saw bits of the side of the runway quite quickly. It really did have a lot of precession from this big propeller, that's for sure. But what a wonderful airplane to fly. It had tabs on the aileron, so as you went faster, there was no increase in load, so it certainly didn't get stiffer. And fast it was. You cruised along with the engine almost ticking over at about 220, 230 knots, effortless. And if you put the power up a bit, you were really zinging along. It was just the most marvelous airplane. Typical of Hawkers, lovely wide undercarriage, still a bit like the Hurricane. When you were landing in the 3-point attitude, your stick was well back. So you had to be a little bit careful not to run out of it aft. There's a nice picture of Ray and Mark Hanna. Sadly, neither of us are with us. But you get a very good impression of what a monster the old Sea Fury was. And can you imagine being in that cockpit trying to bring it on board a carrier? That's for sure. Very difficult. Back to how we're doing for time, Mike.
Okay. You're about can you hear me, Cliff?
Yeah.
Yeah, you're about 10 past 8, so you got about 20 minutes, a little bit more. I don't think people will mind carrying on. So
yeah, okay. I hope I'm not boring people stiff yet. Anyway, back to OFMC. One of the things that we were delighted in, and which I had done a formation aerobatics going through training, and I'd done quite a little bit in lightning, some of it illegal. But I wasn't in the Red Arrows, I wasn't in aerobatic teams. So when I got to FMC, It was good to be able to get into these airplanes, and they were in their element in aerobatics. And this is myself and I can't remember who else I was flying with that day doing aerobatics in the Spitfire. The Spitfire is a delight to fly anyway. It's also a delight in aerobatics, but in formation aerobatics. But it is such a lovely big wing on that aeroplane that it's the merest bump. If you're on a bumpy thermic day, you really work quite hard because it could displace you quite a lot. So you were working pretty hard in the airplane, although instantly you were able to recover your position because it was so handleable. It nonetheless could get displaced because of that big wing. But one of the delights was to be able to go and do the aerobatics in the airplane. And of course, the hooligan tail chases that we did were a hallmark of Duxford air shows, and they were actually very well choreographed. And this is really quite a good picture, because here you've got I think they're 2 Mark 5s. There is distinguished by the single radiator, and here is the Mark 16. Me trying to keep up with them. Mark 5 was very quick at low level because it didn't have quite the drag. And even though you had the extra power, that power in the 9 and 16 only came into play at the higher levels. I've been always wanting to fly this airplane, and then the opportunity came. This is Big Beautiful Doll, which is sadly no longer with us, and this is Rob Davis flying the aeroplane. He bought the airplane from flying the old Flying Machine Company. I first flew this airplane about a year after I'd been on the old Flying Machine Company, and what a delight. Not as instantly handleable as the Spitfire. The Spitfire is a benchmark aeroplane, so it's much heavier in probably all axes than the Spitfire, but it's a bit like a Cadillac. It's built for Midwestern cowboys, whereas the Spitfire was quite cozy. You had a lovely big cockpit, a floor to the cockpit, which is a novelty. There's no floor in the Spitfire or the Hurricane, so if you dropped your map, it stayed dropped. A rudder, aileron and elevator trim in this airplane. No aileron trim in the Spitfire. Obviously, you've got rudder trim and elevator trim, so you had a trim in all axes. Same engine. Same size engine as the Merlin in the Mark 9 and 16, in other words, 1600 horsepower. So it doesn't climb nearly as fast as the Spitfire, but of course, with that extra weight, it used to come down the hill pretty damn quickly. And it was. It's not strictly a laminar flow wing, everybody says it is. Actually, what they've done is they brought the point of the thickest chord back on the wing, which gave it sort of laminar flow characteristics. But a lovely aeroplane to fly, but not one to muck around with at slow speed. The Spitfire will fly at no speed and a lot of speed, but the Mustang will bite you if you fly it too slow in maneuver, particularly if you're pulling hard, and it flicks beautifully. Whereas the Spitfire just burbles when you get it to the store. But nonetheless, a war-winning aeroplane. And bear in mind that from concept, design, manufacture, this flew in 185 days. It's just, and that's the early Mustangs with the Allison engine, which was a good aeroplane, but only at low level. When they fitted the Merlin, it became a world beater. This airplane, as many of you will know, got hit by a Sky Raider about there, and Rob was only at about 1,000 feet, I think, and did a successful bailout because he had practiced it, and the airplane unfortunately is no more. that is another picture of typical of America. I'm flying this one, slender, tender and tall. And this is the great Lee Louderbeck in this one, who, would you believe, has got 6,000 hours, or did have in those days, on Mustangs. That's just what I should know. So I show this, it's actually me going into Bicester about 4 years ago with a fuel leak, but it just shows the wonderful design of the radiator on the Mustang. Unlike the Spitfire, which are out here, this radiator design and the variable exhaust actually almost negated the thrust you got from the back end, almost negated the drag of the aeroplane. But isn't it interesting? Everybody talks about how fast the Mustang was. The Spitfire actually had a far better wing in the dive. This hit a critical Mach number. It was better than the P-47, better than certainly than the P-38, which is the Lightning, which they lost a lot in compressibility. But an airplane that would go to Berlin and fight and come back, amazing airplane. I then was lucky enough to go on to Black 6 on the invitation from John Allison. Charlie Brown and Dave Southwood were flying it as well. I found this airplane quite intimidating. It was great to fly, but think about this. It had awful brakes. Messerschmitt put a tailplane on it, I think, for mere decoration rather than for any real aerodynamic advantage, that's for sure. I always remember Dave Southwood saying to me on takeoff the airplane, he said, look, Cliff, when you get to about 50 knots, on the takeoff roll, wherever you're pointing, that's the direction you're going to get airborne in. So make sure it's pointing down the runway. Never a truer word was said. A Daimler-Benz 605 engine. It was quick. It was quicker than the Spitfire, equivalent Mark 9 Spitfire, in straight and level, and rolled beautifully. Rolled very well. But I found it's got no rudder trim, would you believe? And so you had to work the rudders all the time. And at certain high speeds, you were standing on one rudder, and that was known for this type of aeroplane. And surprisingly heavy in pitch, but very stable. It would come round finals with the outboard slats here. It would come round finals when you got the gear down, on rails with no speed deviation. If you set the aircraft up correctly, it would come round on rails. And everybody said it must have been a pig to land. I actually didn't find the landing. It was about a few milliseconds after landing that the trouble started. Because if you started to get a wiggle on, if you tried the brakes, you could, these early brakes on this Spitfire, sorry, this 109 were appalling. And so you had to be careful not to fade the brakes early, because if you did, then you were in what I call coughing corner, because you were slowing down. The rudder wasn't working, the brakes weren't working. So you had to be very careful that you were going in the right direction, that's for sure. I liked the aeroplane, but I didn't fly it enough to get it to love it. If you talk to Charlie and Dave Southwood, they really, really enjoyed the airplane. More of this type in a minute. I then went on to one of my favorites, and I was offered the chance to fly the Corsair. This is an FG-1D Corsair, massive propeller, which is why Vought bent the wings, reverse gull wing, really to stop the undercarriage being long and stalky, just to keep prop clearance. If you look at the size of the prop, you can imagine with the tail up, you've not got a great deal of prop clearance. But surprisingly ungainly, as some may think, it's a beautifully balanced aeroplane. It's not a Spitfire, but it had great elevators, a lot of rudder control, and the ailerons were great as well. So, and a big wing. So it flew, it was the fastest airplane of its time. It's first airplane to exceed 400 miles an hour straight and level when it first came out. And you can, this is, we mentioned Bouchon earlier on while we were talking, with those big flaps and that lovely squidgy undercarriage, you could bring it in remarkably slowly over the hedge. And this is the short grass strip at Bouchon in Yorkshire. And it was short in those days, it's longer now. But with the great brakes, you could drop it on in a 3-point attitude and it would stop very, very quickly. The caveat to that is if you had a crosswind with that wing like that, if anything like a crosswind, you had to put the wing down into wing and land it on, probably on one wheel, and you certainly wouldn't carry full flap. Otherwise, you'd run out of aileron very quickly. Lovely to display, lovely big engine. This engine is about 2,100 horsepower of twin row radial. The same engine that fits in the P-47 Thunderbolt and the Hellcat as well. And as you can see, and I'll just go back if I may, despite that long nose, with the flap down, you could actually just about see over the nose in the approach, not in the final flare, but certainly better than some aeroplanes, not as bad as some. And I really enjoyed aerobating this aeroplane. It wasn't so sensitive at slow speed as the Mustang, not as good as the Spitfire, but certainly very good. I'm just going to rest and have a glass of wine now, drink a slurp of wine. I want some hands up to tell me which airplane I'm intercepting in this. I'll come off that phoning the noise. I've got the technique. Yeah, well, that gave me the chance to have a slurp of wine. That was Intercepting the Vulcan, of course, off, and well done for all the hands that came up in a Spitfire 2-seater. I was lucky enough to do that a couple of years ago while the Vulcan was still flying, and we were doing some filming with the front camera out of the Spitfire. That particular sortie, I was flying with a delightful chap sitting in the back cockpit who had done a lot of sponsorship for the Vulcan, and he'd been bought a ride in the Spitfire. The blades you didn't see were outside of me in that sortie. Anyway, he was bought this ride, and I closed on up, and I had to go under the jet wash. Eventually, I went right up under the belly of the airplane. I didn't take it that, and the chap had been very animated in the back, and then I noticed he hadn't been saying anything for a couple of minutes, and while I was sitting right underneath his Vulcan, and you could actually just hear the engines a little bit. And I said, "Are you okay back there?" And this voice from the back said, "Yes, we're not going to go any closer, are we?" And so I said, "No, we're not going to go any closer." Anyway, so that was just a little interlude in one of the other diversions, and lucky enough to be in that. I then got on to the Bouchon. Again, a bit of a story for that, and I know I'm running out of time. An airplane I got, although I said with Black 6, I really didn't get to know it well enough. Essentially the same airframe, but with a Merlin engine. And I did actually feel a little bit more comfortable behind the Merlin than the Daimler-Benz. I never thought the Daimler-Benz rightly or wrongly, I did not feel as comfortable with it. Big engine, 37 litres, and that it was. It just, I didn't feel quite, shall we say, trust it as much as I did the Merlin. Anyway, these were, I went on to the Bouchon. Again, Mark caught me one day in the office and said, would I like to fly the Bouchon? Of course, I said yes, anticipating a nice sunny day at Duxford with 10 knots down the strip. I said, yeah, where do you want? He said, I said, I've got a week off between jobs, actually. He said, well, I've got the Bouchon at Sion in Switzerland. Would you go and pick it up and take it to Warsaw? Yeah, well, like all pilots, I said, no, I shouldn't say yes to that. And I did. And that it's a story in itself, getting the aeroplane through Augsburg, Bouchon, and then to Warsaw. But I got to, sorry, let me just go back. I got to like this airplane very much. Again, similar aerodynamic characteristics to the Black Six, indeed, almost identical. So quite heavy in pitch, always working the rudder, great in roll, and really quite quick. Much more stable in some ways than the Spitfire because it's much higher wing loading. But it had its foibles, and this is one of them. This is me. I'm showing that all pilots make a mistake, and I've probably made more than most. This is using too much power on takeoff. I don't think I was being over enthusiastic. I just used a bit too much power, and I just didn't have, as the torque overcame the roll authority I had, I just scraped the wingtip. The airplane was flying again in the afternoon, but I was rather severely embarrassed by the fact that it taught me a lesson that these airplanes, if you do use too much power before you've got good aerodynamic control, then you can catch a cold, particularly in this airplane. And they did say that, true or not, that the Germans lost more 109s in takeoff and landing accidents than they did in combat. I can believe that. Not an airplane to be triced with on the ground. But in the air, strangely enough, aerobating it was a delight because it was that much heavier and that much more stable. You didn't dance around quite as much. And this is John Romain in this one and myself in one of the other 109. Going up for, I think we're just changing from a loop to a barrel roll. And because it was so stable, you didn't jink around. So you could actually fly the airplane very well in close formation in aerobatics. That's just, again, John leading myself, and I'm mirroring it. You switch from echelon to, I switched to line astern as we went round the barrel roll, because it's easier, frankly. But wonderful prop vortices coming off the 109. But of course, flying the 109, you always had to lose when you were flying against any Allied airplane. And this is Rob Davies shooting me down in Karlstad in Sweden. I've got another lovely picture of Charlie Brown monstering me at Duxford at Shoreham in the Mark V. And there's no doubt about it. When a Spitfire, you can understand why the Spitfire was so good. Even though I was sometimes working hard, really trying to shake the Spitfire off, I couldn't do it in the 109. I now show this one because I'm doing this seemingly out of order. But I then was lucky enough to, excuse me, fly the Mark I Spitfire. After flying all these rather high-powered airplanes, I got the chance a few years back to fly this aircraft, which is based at Duxford. It is, as probably some of you have read, it's one that was resurrected out of the sand off the beach in Dunkirk, excuse me, and rebuilt. And it is rebuilt to the absolute nth degree of authenticity. It's got an early Merlin 3 engine, which is about 1,000 horsepower. And still got the canvas ailerons that they had. I do beg your pardon. And interestingly, that little rear view mirror is actually the original one. Stevenson, who was flying this airplane when it was shot down during the Dunkirk campaign, and you've all seen the film, this is one that belly landed on the sand. Before, Stevenson said, I've got no rear view mirror, go and take it off my sports car, to his rigger. That is actually the one he took off, and it actually survived on the original airplane. A lot of it's obviously been rebuilt to new standard, but it as far as the aeroplane is concerned, it is absolutely as it was. And of course, the prop control is just 2 positions. You've either got fine or coarse, not a constant speed propeller, which came later. And that is an interesting picture, because that was Paul Bonham in this airplane, John Romain and myself. And I always remember Paul Bonham saying to me, you two, to John and I, you guys were working hard. And we said, well, we've got a fixed pitch propeller effectively in R2 airplanes, because once you'd moved it, you only had the throttle, and the engine either died off as you throttled back. Whereas, although this was a Mark I, Paul had a constant speed propeller, and the difference it makes is amazing. That was again taken by John Dibbs for the Spitfire film. I'm quite proud of that, because that was 2 months after my 70th birthday. So it was a bit of a birthday present. But the Mark I had its foibles. One of the things is it's unlike later ones, later Spitfires, the engine is unpressurized. The coolant system is unpressurized, and it heats up and does boil very quickly. And this was supposedly on my way to Goodwood, and I had to hang around for some of my wingmen under Blenheim, and I thought I was going to get away with it. I rolled and she popped off, and I really did get covered in very hot, luckily my canopy was closed, hot steam. One of my wingmen who got airborne, and I've got another picture of the wingmen getting past me, they all got airborne. I aborted and went down later. But out of the ether, an unidentified transmission came down as I was just sitting in the middle of the airfield. And with a comment from the ether came, has anyone got a tea bag? Because I think I look more like a kettle. I show this because, in contrast, I was also flying probably the nicest Griffon engine airplane, Spitfire, you could wish to fly. It's the Mark 18. Why is it the nicest? Well, it's a very late model Spitfire, even later than the 19. Marks do not coincide with dates for the Spitfire, because it's got a better empennage, and so directional control on the ground is great. It's like a big Mark V Spitfire, absolutely gorgeous to fly in every respect. A lot of people forget that the wing on the Spitfire, that wing is exactly the same profile as that Mark I Spitfire as I showed you a minute ago. And there have been people who said, well, when the Spitfire became that big, it really wasn't a Spitfire anymore. I couldn't disagree more. They all fly. They all got the personalities of being a Spitfire, for sure. And although this one is inevitably a lot heavier than the earlier Spitfire, not so dainty, it certainly is still a Spitfire. I'm going to tweak through this a little bit. It's just memories really of the Ray Hanna, Lee Proudfoot, Nigel Lamb and myself in the Corsair. It's really a salute to Ray Hanna, who was a delight to fly, even though when I was flying, I couldn't see his head, but whenever you flew with Ray, you just looked at his head and that would tell you either a nod forward or a nod back or a nod left or right to what he was doing. Never said a word. Obviously, I couldn't see anything from the back here, but I was lucky. I was in the Corsair, so I had all the power, big wing. I had the easy job in this. And I always remember when we were early practicing, and there's Ray going over the front, over the top, leading us. I got this laconic voice from this New Zealander: "Don't you cut my tail off, Air Marshal," which I wasn't about to do because I gave him plenty of room. But I did have to. It's quite interesting. It was early days, and the Spitfire was great going up the hill, whereas the Mustang was on high power. And going over the top, the Spitfire was back on power because it was at slow speed, but the Mustang still up on power. Going down the hill, the Spitfire was right up on power and the Mustang was right back on power. So these guys were working quite hard. In the meantime, I was right. I had more power than I needed, and I had more weight than I needed. So I was well versed. I was well equipped in the Corsair. And just to go back to what I was saying earlier on, why I like the Corsair, look at the size of the wing on the Mustang and the size of the wing on the Corsair. Great airplane. Have I got time to talk about jets, Mike? Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I think you have, Cliff. I think everyone's no one's leaving anyway. So
okay,
carry on.
I was lucky to be able to fly the jets. This sadly came to an end at Duxford with another pilot, but we flew the T-33 quite extensively. What a delightful jet this is. Canadian built this one with the Neen engine, so it had about 5,000 pounds of thrust. So it wasn't short on thrust. Huge tip tanks. I brought this airplane back from Switzerland, low level, with plenty of fuel. You'd go twice as far if you went to height, but of course we weren't allowed by Civil Aviation Authority to do that. So it was a lovely ailerons, just a delight to fly, and very simple. Remember, this was a derivative of one of the early P-80 fighters, but it became almost a standard jet trainer in North America, and one could see why, because it was such a delightful airplane with really quite a high performance, lovely slim wing, but nonetheless had good low speed handling characteristics. Really an excellent airplane in all respects. Just a couple of shots. And of course, the other thing we flew was the Sabre. A lot of people talked about the Gloucester Meteor, which came, the Mark T7, which was rebuilt, lovely rebuild, and with great fanfare. It was announced as being the oldest flying jet. Well, actually, it wasn't the oldest flying jet. This was the oldest one in UK anyway. This was built in 1948. It's an early Mark, it's early A model. So you actually flew it with cables and you got backed up by hydraulics rather than hydraulics powering it. And as you put, say, 2 pounds of force in the controls, whatever way you were moving them, that was augmented by about 37 times by the hydraulics. Made it a bit notchy in to fly. And I understand that later Sabres flew much better in handling characteristics than this. It certainly wasn't as light as the Hunter, this model, but that lovely big wing made it an absolute delight to do aerobatics in nonetheless. You had to be very careful with the engine, an early axial flow, mishandling at slow engine RPM down on the ground, and you'd literally melt the engine. And that, I think, is just another of John Dibbs's studies. He was hanging out the back of a Bonanza when that was taken, and on the radio saying, "Can you come closer? Can you come closer?" I thought I was going to hoover the airplane up, but it's one of John Dibbs's great shots. a lovely airplane to aerobat, but one you had to be a little bit careful with. It was a swept-winged aircraft after all. And I thought I'd finish my presentation with this. And that's it. I'm sorry, I've overrun a huge amount. I've got other slides, Mark, but I'm afraid I've bored you to tears already. But
no, I don't think anyone was bored, Cliff. That was brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Cliff. Awesome, as always. Thank you.
Fantastic, Cliff. Thanks.
Well, I hope I'm sorry that I rather superficially went through a lot of those airplanes. It was either do some of them in depth and in more depth than I did, or cover a few more airplanes. But I'm open to any questions if those of you have got the time or the patience.
I'd love to ask you a question, Cliff, if I may. Good evening, Terry.
Hi, Andy.
How are you doing?
Yeah,
Cliff, the last time I saw you face to face was December 1993, when you were pinning my brevet on me at Waddington, just after I did the OCU course on Century as an airborne technician. I still have the brevet, and I'm very, very proud of it, even more so the fact that you gave it to me. I did pick up, though, that wasn't the point of this, that I did pick up at the beginning, you said when you picked up 1118 group, you had the pleasure of flying Nimrod, but you never mentioned Century.
Well,
did you not get?
Again, it's a case of 1118. Andy was amazing group. I was again lucky enough to fly I was qualified on the Hawk, so I had my own Hawk. Would you believe? I was qualified on Tornado, and I was qualified on Nimrod. Those were the three. I flew the Sentry, I flew the Sea King, and I flew the Nimrod R1. But I flew the Nimrod. That was no different in upfront techniques. And of course, we had Wessex just briefly towards the end before we had our Sea Kings. So it was a very broad and diverse. So I apologize for not mentioning the Sentry. I did fly it. That's for sure. And I always remember I did a few sorties in it. I didn't qualify to the extent I did on the Nimrod, which I did actually qualify on the Nimrod. But I always remember flying into it. If you had more than 5 degrees, I think, of bank on the Sentry on landing, you would wipe out one of the outboard engines,
Yes.
or the outboard flap. And I do remember that the Sentry was a real man's machine in every possible way to fly. And probably it was time as much as anything. But if there was one airplane you really needed to be on top of, it's certainly in the landing configuration, it was the Sentry. So I apologize for not mentioning it. There are lots of other airplanes which like that and that, which I would love to talk about in my later career. So I apologize for that. And the other thing about the Sentry, which is worth, without going into too many details, because I'm not sure where information and security, the line goes with this, but when we were being controlled, when we had JTIDs in the Sentry, and we also had it equipped in the F3, we all talked about the F3 being not quite the agile airplane that things like the F-16s were, but I can remember flying where electronically, and I won't go any further, the Sentry was talking to us in the F3s, and we went on a 4v4 F-16s with the F3, and we got them all. They never got close to us. And that was all because of the amazing electronic air picture we had. And I'm caveating that slightly because I just don't know where the security on this is these days. So the Sentry was an amazing force multiplier for us all. Although, as I say, I didn't fly it that too much.
It was a good 7 years of my life.
Yeah, great people. That's and great airplane in every respect. Can I answer any other questions?
Cliff, I've got one for you. I noticed how much time you had on the Lightning. You're showing earlier on.
Yeah,
that's an awful lot of sorties. I just wondered how long you managed to squeeze out for your longest sortie in a Lightning, given how fuel critical it was.
But it's fun enough, Howard. I've just been, as I said, I'm writing my journal more for my grandchildren than anything else. And I was just looking at that today because I suppose the longest sorties we did were the tanking sorties to Cyprus, which were about 5.5 hours. We used to go with a cloud of Victor 1s because we were going to Cyprus. We had to have five refueling brackets on the way. And what used to happen, you'd go in a pair, normally with a pair of Victors, would you believe? One Victor would fill you up, your first bracket, and then the Victor would top up the other Victor that was with us, would you believe? So they would air-to-air refuel. That Victor would go back to Marham. We would go on with that Victor, which would take us all the way down through France, down past Sardinia, Corsica, Sardinia. And then we would have another bracket, and in fact, another two. We'd drain that tanker dry. He would go into Palermo. Meanwhile, another tanker would come out of Palermo, which we would meet up over Sicily, and he would take us all the rest of the way to Akrotiri. So we spent our time, and part of that was keeping enough fuel on board to make sure that we had an emergency, we had the fuel to divert. So the airplane was an airborne emergency as far as fuel was concerned, Howard, the Lightning. And although it was an absolute delight to fly, I'd be the first to admit that it was underfueled and underarmed as a weapon of war. But when it was designed, of course, for us young guys, to be able to fly it 4 times a day, which we did. I mean, I've looked in my logbook, I've regularly got 28 hours a month in the aeroplane. And that was also testament to the engineers. It wasn't an easy airplane to keep serviceable. And our engineers were bloody good. I mean, it had a tendency for fuel leaks, so we lost a lot of lightnings. But our engineers would day and night work to keep those airplanes serviceable. And that we did that much flying was really testament to them.
Great, thanks,
Jeff,
Chris.
there's a question from Amanda Harrison on the chat who says, what was your favorite airplane to fly?
Oh, well, Terry, that's a question that probably many of you get asked who've got quite a few types. It's a difficult one. If I go back to my operational flying, I think the best warplane, I say time for time, although the F3 was becoming really very capable towards the end of its life, I think probably the Phantom as the best warplane. The best in terms of jet, just from thrill a minute, it had to be the Lightning. On the old aeroplanes, I suppose who wouldn't want to get airborne in a Sea Fury and growl away? But if God said to me, you've got one more flight in one aeroplane, and that's your lot, it'll have to be the Spitfire.
And another question has come up saying, which one did you most dislike?
Well, I've never disliked any aeroplane. I'm going to do a quick rundown here in a second, because I might have a picture of an aeroplane. That's Charlie Brown shooting me down again. Oh, there it is. That's an aeroplane I have the greatest respect for, and I think the single wing Rata. This is an Polikarpov 152. It was by reputation the fastest biplane that was ever built. I think it's got an Ash 1,000 horsepower engine and retractable undercarriage. There was a fixed wheel version, earlier version. And of course they had a monoplane called the Rata, the Rat, which I didn't fly, which apparently was really a handful. But look at the short couple of that airplane. And I flew it in New Zealand. That's a look of relief, by the way, because I got it on the ground. And I went flying in it. It went pretty bloody quickly, but you had to be very. Stuart Goldspink gave me the briefing for landing it, and he said, Cliff, you're used to losing the runway when you roll out in a lot of these airplanes in the very final stages. He said, in the 152, you'll lose the airfield. And I said, you joking, but if you look at this, me taxiing back in this airplane, look at that top wing and the rest of it and where you're sitting on what, you just can't see anything. The lucky thing was, as you rolled into finals, it was so short coupled, you went into an instant side slip. You could side slip it easily. So you had to side slip it in. I wouldn't say I didn't like it, but it's one I flew, which I wasn't rushing back to fly again, if that answers the question. Have I stunned you all into silence?
There's a question about flying the Spitfire to Czech Republic from Thomas Klicker.
He says, tell us some more about flying to Czechoslovakia or the Czech Republic.
Okay. I don't know whether I've got a picture of the airplane. I'll try and go back to it in a second. Anyway, we'll stay on a Spitfire. Anyway, it wasn't this Spitfire. The trip to the Czech Republic was interesting because we've been flying in MH434 at a place called Milos in Switzerland, and this came up quite late in the day, actually, while we were down there. And I was asked to go to Pardubice in the Czech Republic for a gathering, and it was all rather short notice. So I got airborne on what was a rather nice day from Switzerland, flew up through Liechtenstein over the Alps, which was in itself a delight. Who wouldn't want to be in good weather flying over the Alps and in a Spitfire? And I was following a cold front, which was moving off to the east, but I got my timing rather wrong, and I caught up with the cold front as I was approaching the Danube. So I had to divert, and I got a few airfields mapped out for diversion, which were long enough. So I chose an airfield called Wilshofen. Now, as I'm sure you know, that part of Bavaria is the seat of the old Reich. And I hadn't thought about that before I landed, but I landed at Wilshofen, which was probably not a good choice of airfield. Although it was long, I found I was landing, the approach had poplar trees either side of the threshold of the runway. So it was a bit like landing through cricket stumps with the middle stump missing, which I found a bit intimidating. And it was also interesting because MH434 had an appalling radio. So I kept saying I was on diversion into Wilshofen, and I got this, "Yeah, Cessna, you are clear to land." And I said, "No, I'm a Spitfire." "Yeah, Cessna, you can land." So anyway, I landed, and I was very mindful of the fact that MH434 had some all its victories emblazoned on the side. And I thought, I wonder how this is going to go down in the seat of the Third Reich, down in Bavaria. Anyway, I landed, and as I turned around, there was a sort of a pause from air traffic, and they said, "Ah, you are a Spitfire." And anyway, they obviously forgot the black crosses, and I was dutifully serenaded by the local mayor and all his people before I left for Pardubice. I arrived in Pardubice a little later than I had anticipated, but they had a lot of the old Czech pilots, believe it or not, still around. Well, this is several years ago. And I taxied into what I thought was a deserted airfield because everybody, and then suddenly there was this crowd of people and all these Czech Spitfire pilots. And remember, the Czechs had, when they finished the war, they inherited the Spitfires they were flying and took them back to the Czech Republic before the Warsaw Soviets really sort of pushed them out. Some of those Spitfires actually finished up in Israel, some of their Spitfires. But I found it very emotional because suddenly you were seeing old boys who had been under the yoke of the Warsaw Pact for so many decades. And suddenly they were back. And these were heroes who had really come out of almost the undergrowth. And suddenly they were confronted with an aeroplane which they'd flown so many years before. So it was a very emotional, I've found flying these aeroplanes, the emotional aspects to it has been almost as important as flying the airplanes.
Thanks, Cliff. I think that's a very good note on which to end. We've almost reached the witching hour. So it's probably time and appropriate for me to say thanks so much from the Cambridge Aero Club for giving an absolutely brilliant talk about just a fraction of your remarkable flying career. You brought back a few memories to a lot of us, I know. I love that particular picture of the Lightning going vertical over Benbrook being flown by the late Mike Thompson. I could see my Mary Quarter in the background. And Bugs Bendel was a great friend, and sadly he is no longer with us.
No.
But Cliff, that was a highly informative and entertaining talk, which kept us all enthralled. I do indeed owe you a beer, and I think it's rather more than a beer. So you're going to have to come and claim your reward, but it's richly deserved. It was a wonderful, wonderful talk. And on behalf of the Cambridge Aero Club, thanks so very much indeed for providing it. And an advert for everybody that it was the last of our regular entertaining talks for this winter, but we've got a Gasco safety evening on the 22nd of March. More details of that will be promulgated. But thanks everybody for coming. We've all enjoyed the talk, Cliff. Thanks so much for delivering it in such style and such eloquence. It was a very entertaining evening. Thank you.